Thank you. I think there are about 4 or 5 Gilmore boys, and it'd be rather nice actually to be chairing something which consisted only of Gilmores. But we're not, and we have some very distinguished substitutes for Gilmores, some non-Gilmores. Andrew is an actual Gilmore. He's a director in the Secretary General's office at the United Nations. He is a friend and former colleague. We worked together for a few years at the UN. Tim Phillips runs a very interesting NGO called Beyond Conflict, which goes into conflict situations and brings in players from other previous conflicts so that people can learn from how societies have extricated themselves from conflict. Joost Hilterman is from the crisis group. I recall that when I was at the UN and we were in a lot of trouble in Iraq, he came and told us how we should get out of it. Unfortunately, he didn't go down to Washington and give them similar advice, or perhaps we might not be where we are today. David Gorman is a colleague of mine from the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue. He's the manager of a large program there, and he worked for, I can't remember whether it was 8 or 9 years in the southern Philippines, working on the peace process there, which recently reached a measure of success. Now we've got 50 minutes. I'd like to use it as productively as possible and to give as much of that 50 minutes to you as the audience to ask us what you would really like to know. So I think we're going to start off with rather brief introductions. And I've asked our panelists to concentrate on the following. If you think of conflict resolution as a canvas, a big chunk of that canvas is taken up with the 800-pound gorilla which is not in the room, namely the United States and perhaps some other major regional players, but it leaves a lot of canvas where there is political space, where there is scope for other players to operate and to seek to bring about the end of conflict, or at least the better management of conflict. And of course, Andrew is the United Nations, and the United Nations has a major mandate in that field. And these two gentlemen from the NGOs are in areas where there is plenty of space for what I think is called weak mediation. In other words, where the parties do not feel threatened, as they sometimes are, by having the gorilla in the room with them, however benevolent the gorilla may be. Joost, I think, with ICG, with the crisis group, tends to work on the analytical framework to underpin some of this mediation by non-government organizations. So, with those 2 lengthy words of introduction, let me ask the 4 panelists, please, to give me 5 minutes, or give us 5 minutes each, on exactly where on the canvas they think that they fit, what they should be dealing with, and almost equally important, what they shouldn't be dealing with or what they can't deal with. Andrew.
Thank you. Well, I think the point of the UN's intervention in disputes and conflict resolution is to bring universal international legitimacy to the issue, and which in the end comes to the Security Council, and the aim is that it codifies and sort of, in a way, sanctifies whatever agreement is reached. The UN also brings, and people turn to it because it can bring so world-class mediators such as Lakhdar Brahimi, who is most recently dealing with Syria, but previously on Afghanistan and Iraq. And for when it comes to peacekeeping, it brings a sort of an international mechanism for the funding of international peacekeepers and for the way they operate. Now, what is required for that? I mean, obviously, the agreement of the international of the big 700-pound gorilla. I mean, it's very rare to find an example of where the UN is involved against the wishes of the United States. I mean, that is its reality. It's not envisaged in the Charter so much that one country would decide, would have such a say on it, but it's reality. But the other things which are required for UN intervention are the agreement of both parties, and particularly the stronger party, and I'll come to that in a second. Both parties really have to agree to the UN's role, and it needs the agreement of the neighborhood, the regional countries, and finally it needs the agreement of the really big countries, the US and the big powers. What often happens in many disputes is that the stronger side, and it may be the occupying side or the aggressor, is the side that's most averse to having the UN involved. Currently, I mean, Ukraine is quite keen to have the UN involved, and Russia is very keen not to do so, whether it's either on Crimea or on the east. Pakistan would like the UN to be involved in Kashmir. India, which has possession of it and is also a much more powerful country, is one that blocks it. The Palestinians are desperate to have UN intervention, both in the negotiations and subsequently in peacekeeping operation. The Israelis are equally desperate to keep it out. So, and on another issue like the Falkland Islands, the Argentinians would like the UN to be involved. The British, who have the possession of the islands, consistently block any UN role. So you need both parties to want the UN. Both parties have to want that international legitimacy to an agreement. And as I said, almost invariably, well, not almost invariably, but almost invariably when one party doesn't, it's the stronger one that doesn't. So the UN has always, and that was part of the vision for it in the beginning in the 1950s, and Dag Hammarskjöld, the legendary Secretary General of the 1950s, saw the UN as being the place for the underdog, for where weak countries could get a fair hearing. And unfortunately, that is very often not the case. So these are some of the areas where you need to have the UN involved. You will find in many disputes in Africa right now that there's reluctance to get the UN involved. There's sort of the mantra, African solutions for African problems. So either the African Union or the sub-regional grouping, whether it's in West Africa, East Africa, or Central Africa, will try in the first instance to see if they can resolve it without the support of the international community other than financial. And it's only really when it gets beyond that and normally by this point the conflict has reached such a point that it's very hard to resolve it. But it's rare that the UN is brought in the first instance. Other people always want to have the first bite of the cherry to resolve it. And it's at that later stage, normally too late, by the way, that the UN needs to come in. That's just a quick.
Thank you, Andrew. I was struck when I was at the UN by the number of occasions where the neighbours couldn't act effectively because of the amount of jealousy, and also by the fact that when the UN, with its legitimacy, often provided a mediator who was from somewhere far away. So in East Timor, our lead mediator in practice was from Eritrea. So he couldn't be thought to be biased either in favour of the Timorese or the Indonesians. And in Cyprus, where I was involved for many years, we historically always had a Latin American for the same reason. So, as you say, the regional powers may want to, but very often they find they can't because they're not accepted. Tim, you come from a very different corner of the canvas. Please.
Well, thank you, Karen, and thank Mark and everybody for inviting me back this year. Listening to Andrew's opening about the role of the UN and playing a very important role going into countries, but not necessarily always being welcomed by the various sides, particularly governments. And I was thinking that the best way of describing what we do in Beyond Conflict is we're about giving people a sense of hope, meaning giving people a sense that change is possible. I often say that we're like the support group for change that people need to engage with. You know, bringing in people who have been through equally difficult times, who have had to negotiate from a government's perspective or from a liberation movement's perspective or a dissident's perspective, change. You know, at the end of the day, all of this is about change, and humans taking on the difficult task of overcoming hatred, fear, division, fear of compromise. And we all know at this table, and I think probably everybody in this room, how difficult that is in any setting. And what we've found over the 23 years of doing this work, that people get empowered, not always in the beginning, but after sort of repeated engagement, to hear, well, if these two people could negotiate the end of apartheid, then maybe we can address our problem in this country. Or if these are the people who struggled with achieving a peace agreement in Northern Ireland or the change in East Timor, then maybe we can do it here. And so that's our piece of this overall challenge or puzzle, which is to be the therapeutic approach, but not in a soft way, but in a real sort of direct and hard way, is to say, listen, if these people can do it, maybe you can do it as well.
Thank you, Tim. Joost, I'm going to come to you last, because you're the, if you like, the analytical underpinning of all this. David.
Sure. Thank you very much, Kieran. And thank you very much to the organizers. And it's my first Beyond Borders festival, and it's really quite a exciting scene to be here and to come to such a event. It was really, I was asked in an interview today about Beyond Borders and what it means to me, and I had just gotten off a plane and just arrived here. But even within moments, I sort of felt a sense that this gives people a space in which they can come to, in which they can take a step back from many of the conflicts that they're involved in. And we have a big group of Ukrainians here, where they can reflect a little bit on how Scotland, for example, is going through a process of change right now. And it's doing it peacefully through democratic means and public and legal, constitutional methods. It's a lot to learn from, certainly from here and from this festival. For the organization I work for, the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue, we are a Swiss-based organization established about 15 years ago. And we were established in the context of the brutal wars in Rwanda and Bosnia, where it was felt that the international community had let the people down, that it hadn't responded adequately enough to the situation there. And so it was felt that there needed to be, as part of this landscape, an organization which could impartially, without any types of ties to states, hence why we're Geneva-based, which could impartially engage with parties to a conflict creatively and confidentially. And the reason that humanitarian part of that dialogue comes in, based on humanitarian principles. So often we find ourselves involved in conflicts that maybe, as Andrew was saying, the UN is unable to become involved with because one of the parties may not accept that, or that, frankly, the international community might find very difficult to engage with because perhaps some of the groups are prescribed as terrorists. Or perhaps they might find that it's just a process that's been going on for years and has lost a bit of the creativity and a bit of the risk-taking that, frankly, is necessary in some processes at certain times. And it's something that a small little Swiss-based non-governmental organization can inject in without fear of upsetting diplomatic protocol and what have you, something that we're often quite good at. So the center, since it's over the last 15 years, this organization and others that have now grown up to fill in this area, often referred to as private diplomacy, has now been a very large part of the mosaic. And I think it, in many ways, has contributed quite a bit to helping inject a bit of creativity into processes that probably in many cases eventually need to be resolved with the states, but we help get them hopefully to the table. The risk, of course, is the proliferation of a lot of these small organizations. We're not mandated legally. We weren't elected to do this type of work. So certainly there's a lot of crossing of wires in the community. There's always going to be questions about professionalism. And perhaps the most pressing concern about non-governmental organizations, or what we see also as individuals involved in statecraft, is legitimating groups that are engaged in conflict that may not indeed represent the people that they purport to represent. So there's many opportunities that this new part of the landscape certainly has to offer, but there are also risks, and so we need to have the proper checks and balances.
Thank you. Joost.
Well, first of all, it's a real honor to be here. It's my first visit to Scotland, so I have to say thank you for allowing a Dutchman to infiltrate your your people and to present here. My organization, the International Crisis Group, exists just about as long as yours. The HD Center comes out of the same tradition, the tragedies in Rwanda and the Balkans, and is doing a somewhat different thing, but within the general family of organizations that seek to better the world by preventing the outbreak, the continuation, and the recurrence of deadly conflict. There was a Chinese military commander in 500 BC or thereabouts, Sun Tzu, who's quite famous, if you read about these things, and who declared and found in practice that every battle is really won before it is fought. And the way to win the battle is by choosing the terrain. Now, what Crisis Group does, my organization does, it chooses the terrain in the battle that we fight, which is the battle to end the conflict, by framing the narrative about the conflict that we're studying. And every conflict is different, and I think it's very, very important to understand that as we look at the panoply of violent conflicts around the world, they are all distinctly different and must be understood on their own terms. There is no grand theory about what drives conflict or how they can be resolved. Each one is unique, and we have to understand the particulars of every single conflict. You may find the same ingredients throughout, but it's the balance between them that really makes the difference. The cultural differences, the history, the various grievances, the violations that take place, the form of government, and the bad government especially, that drives these conflicts. So that is what we do. Now, when David was speaking about the HD Center and the mediation, and Tim as well, and of course what the United Nations does, I was talking with the head of the HD Center not long ago, and he said, we, the HD Center, we are a do organization, and you at the Crisis Group, you are a think organization. And I said, yes, it goes even further. I agree with you. It goes even further. We think about what you do. Because the fact is that once you're in the mediation business, and it's a critical business, you are an actor in deadly conflict. You're not a belligerent, of course, but you are very much an actor. And as an organization that thinks about conflict, we have to look at all the actors, because once you start mediating, for example, you are also playing a critical role. That may contribute to the conflict, hopefully the opposite, but it certainly is a critical role, and we need to understand it. So we provide the analytical framework. Now, the narrative is critically important, and why I say you need to choose your terrain, because everybody has a narrative about conflict. If I'm in a conflict, I'm going to have my own narrative. It's going to be a very self-serving and selective narrative. It's going to be a narrative that reflects my psyche, my psychology, and it reflects also my desire to beat the enemy. What we bring as the International Crisis Group is a narrative that seeks to stay above the fray, to be non-partisan, to be transparent, and that seeks to provide solutions to the conflict by reflecting all the various narratives as they occur among the various sides, and to find a middle ground, some kind of average, if you wish, but some common ground between the sides that could help push the conflict towards a peaceful resolution. This is not what the belligerents necessarily want. They want to defeat each other in many cases, but exhaustion may set in, the losses may be too steep, and there is a need to find a way out. And we help frame that debate, and I think this is the key effort. Now, you can say that's all well nicely said and done, but in the end, in terms of preventing conflicts, all you do is publish reports. And we say, well, that's true, we only publish reports. But we are not alone. I'm a strong believer in the notion of critical mass and of tipping points. I think if we work together as conflict mediation organizations, and various conflict prevention organizations, and with the United Nations, but also with stakeholder governments, outside parties that have the wherewithal to bring conflict to an end, we can move bureaucracies, which is really the hardest thing, to create political will. But you have to do it by creating critical mass and then reach a tipping point where a conflict can be brought to the end. To end on the elephant in the room, Of course, I came and briefed you at the United Nations. I also went to Washington. In fact, I went to Washington more often than I came to New York to brief you at the United Nations. And to what end, you can ask, and you would be right. But I would say this. For one thing, I know that our reports were summarized and read by Dick Cheney at the time, the reports on Iraq, because his aide told me that he had prepared these for him. I have no idea what Dick Cheney read in them or what he acted on but he acted on the basis. I think not, because clearly there was no real result. At the same time, after Bush's re-election, the United States changed strategy, and that was very much a reflection of the failure of American forces in Iraq. Now, anybody could see that failure. Some would have predicted it even before 2003 that it would happen. But we saw that because we were on the ground, in fact, from 2002 onward, and we described it in great, sometimes agonizing detail. And I think there was a lot of traction in Washington for this kind of argument. And in the end, the ideologues in the Bush administration had to take a step back.
Thank you very much, Joost. Just before we move to questions, which I'd like to do soon, I wanted to ask you all your views on two angles. One is, are there any groups or individuals that we shouldn't talk to? For example, groups that are listed as terrorist organizations. Do we have any scruples or reserves about that? And secondly, very different, are there situations in which efforts at conflict resolution or mediation have the effect of prolonging the agony? Because I remember reading in some of the literature that the best outcome is often a complete and early victory for one side over the other in terms of casualties and damage. Anyone want to speak on either of those? And then I'm going to open the floor to questions.
I'll say something. If it's okay, I'll start. Just very briefly, I think that, well, on the first point, what I have found in my experience is that, and mine is almost entirely from a non-governmental perspective, so I can say this a lot more easily, is that at some point the conflicts, the parties are going to engage at some level. Perhaps it's not the formal level that we read about in the papers or in the conference room or the negotiation and so on and so forth, but at some type of a level, some individuals, maybe they're just a commander in a certain level, maybe it's a political representative at some level, or maybe it's just an associate who's familiar with the groups, who can speak with some degree of authority about one of the group's sides' aims, motivations, areas of possible maneuverability when it comes to resolving the conflict peacefully. I was engaged with the Lord's Resistance Army back in 2002 or 2003. And those of you familiar with the Lord's Resistance Army, it adopted many of the same brutal tactics as we see now employed, such as in the Middle East by IS and some of the most horrific types of tactics that one can bring to bear on other people. And I thought a lot about it at that time. Should we engage with this group? I mean, particularly someone like Joseph Kony. Is he someone more that you should, they often said, would be the Savimbi option, of which was Jonas Savimbi, the insurgent leader in Angola who died and then the insurgency ended. Maybe that would be one option. But I did feel that maybe at some level there's someone that we can talk to who we will not legitimate because we're not a state, who we will not, whose actions we will not condone because we do not carry the weight or the mandate or the message of the international community, but someone within that level who might be able to say, okay, we want to end this. Unfortunately, that situation in Uganda, it was just unresolvable militarily, and it was just leading to more and more deaths among the people. So at some point, you needed to have some type of alternative to try to end that horrific situation. So I think that it's not just a binary option of yes, you engage or no, you don't engage. I think it's looking at creative ways that engage with the group, that minimize the risks of how you can try to bring them in from the cold or most importantly, end the conflict. For me, I always tell my younger staff members, stay focused on the ball, and the ball is the people. And if the people, the victims, those within that area that are affected by this conflict, if they're the ones that you think want to have this conflict resolved at any cost, whether it be a military victory or a peaceful one, then you should try within your tools, which in our case is dialogue, to try to engage with them.
Thank you, David. Andrew?
And I think in terms of talking to people, I think essentially there should be nobody to whom a peacemaker is unprepared to talk if the aim is to end a state of war. And on some levels, on humanitarian assistance, for example, there should be absolutely no restrictions. If you're trying to get humanitarian aid to a population in desperate need, then however unsavory they are, you need to talk to them. There are restrictions for us, for example, in the United Nations. If we talk to Hamas, for example, at a political level, we will have a very, very serious message from the United States. And actually Congress will threaten to cut off all its funding to the UN. And brutally, just after you left the UN, in 2006, we were told that if UN officials spoke to Hamas, our families would lose their visa status in the United States. I mean, that was a warning that was given by the Bush administration to those of us involved in that issue at the time. So there are restrictions that we have, even if we disagree with them. I would have thought that everybody except Al-Qaeda, whose sole motivation is the worst is best, that there's absolutely no point talking to them. ISIS, who are in some ways even worse than Al-Qaeda, though, have a different ideology, which is not just terrorism. They are trying to run a state. I imagine at some point they would want to have humanitarian assistance in. On your other question, I'll be very quick about this, you touched on a real ethical dilemma for many people involved in peace negotiations, Kieran, on the issue of whether you're keeping people's hopes alive and perpetuating a war when actually it'd be better to get on with it. And see the inevitable. I mean, this debate happened in the 1990s on Bosnia, and actually that was different, because what happened then, the 5th Cavalry did appear in the end. I mean, NATO and the US did come in 3 years late, but they did finally. And in the end, it was okay. The debate between those who had said, should we just not let the Bosnians are going to lose, let's just end the war and stop providing assistance to them. Similarly, we now have the issue of the Syrian opposition, because nobody believes that the moderate Syrian opposition have a chance of dislodging Assad. So there is now a dilemma as to whether it isn't just better to get on and bite the bullet. So it's a debate that is increasingly going to rage, I think, in relation to Syria.
Thank you. And I suppose, Tim, if for an American citizen, the issue of material assistance is quite a live one. Is there anything you want to say in your defense?
Yeah, well, if this legislation was around 21 years ago, I'd probably be in prison for some of the people I've talked to in this work. I would say two things. I've become a firm believer that all conflict is fundamentally driven by exclusion. So the opposite of that is inclusion. And some of the most sustainable peace agreements have been those where everybody was brought in, and including the spoilers, including those who use violence. And then at the end of the day, those who are maybe just psychopathic or criminally inclined get marginalized. But I really think one has to be focused on inclusion, and at a moment of trying to reach a peace agreement or some settlement, you have to figure out who are all the people, even if they represent not just people using violence, but small groups, bring them in now. Because then once you have them in, you have a more sustainable peace agreement or political agreement in the future. And then from a US perspective, I mean, it's really quite disgusting to hear that the Bush administration did that, or any US administration did that. But Americans forget that in 1933, when Franklin Roosevelt was just elected president, he was secretly sending telegrams to Molotov and Stalin. This is at the height of the Great Terror, saying that we need to establish full diplomatic relations. And he did not even tell his Secretary of State, Cordell Hull, or many members of his national security team, because they would view what he was doing as weakness and undermining US national security interest and being very soft. 30, 40 years later, Richard Nixon, a person I don't often quote, but Richard Nixon in 1969 and Henry Kissinger were secretly negotiating with China, and did not tell their Secretary of State or Secretary of Defense. And there are even transcripts of the conversations between Nixon and Kissinger in 1969, where Nixon says, if my Secretary of Defense or Secretary of State learn what we're doing, I'm in trouble. And so there's precedent of US presidents, a Democrat and Republican, negotiating with the enemy. And this is at a time when those enemies were killing literally millions of their own people, because in 1969, the Cultural Revolution was still alive in China. And many Americans were being held prisoner. So too often American administrations have short histories, or they really don't understand past history. So there is precedent for doing that.
Do you want to say anything on this, Joost?
Just very briefly, to end conflict, you have to understand it. And the only way to understand it is to talk to all sides and to understand what drives a conflict. You cannot exclude anyone. Certainly, whether in mediation or in analysis, you have to talk to all sides. Of course, the question is, can you? And there are groups that you simply cannot talk to now. But these groups have a way of routinizing their rule over time. And not only that, if you look at the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, for example, I mean, they're feeding and they're controlling territory as a very small group of fighters. And the way they do it is by negotiating local deals with the local population, who have their own grievances against central rule. And so what you end up with is really a political dilemma, more than a military one, much more than a military one, in fact, where you want to bring these populations back into the political game and to wean them away from the violent extremists. And then those fringe elements eventually will be marginalized if your strategy is right and you do it well. And so I think that's very important. But you need to be speaking to all of them. To the extent that you cannot, you have to go out of your way to get information about what is it that truly motivates them, and not sort of somebody else's perspective, especially not their rivals' perspective on what motivates them, because it's usually wrong. Finally, just on the issue of terrorism, I don't even use the term as terrorist organization, because I use the word terror. I think it's a highly politicized term that confuses rather than brings clarity, in the sense that everybody's called terrorist these days when you disagree with someone. And I may be overstating it a little bit, but you can see it throughout the conflicts that the enemy is routinely referred to as terrorist. And that's not very helpful. So I think we need to look at the methods. The methods of targeting civilians deliberately is an act of terror. And that needs to be said very clearly, and that needs to be there needs to be a shaming process there. But otherwise, if we call groups terrorists, maybe because they did commit some acts of terror, but then there are a lot of acts of terror committed by all sides, then we basically already say they have no legitimacy. That means we cannot talk to them, they cannot be brought in, and they remain on the outside, and then you cannot resolve the conflict, as Tim rightly said.
Thank you. I remember when I went to Israel in 1982, for the first time, being told by a wise elderly Israeli that one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. I have to say that my own rule of thumb is on talking to people or not is it useful? And if it's useful, you do it. But then it was an enormous liberation to leave government service and then to leave UN service, because you are able, as an NGO, to try to do the right thing. Whereas governments are subject to domestic political pressures, and if you're in the UN, you're subject to pressures, not just from the US, by the way, but I've had more angry calls from the Russian ambassador than from the American ambassador in the time I was there. Everyone wants to lean when they feel their vital interests are affected. All right, now, what would you like us to talk about? Can we have some questions, please? Otherwise, it's going to be a very short session. Gentleman in the front row, are you going to wait for a microphone?
Tim made reference to psychopaths. I think one of the big developments in recent times has been in the area of neuroscience, and there are all sorts of levels of, shall we say, individuals with zero empathy, individuals with emotional dysregulation and things like that. I wonder to what extent, and you also mentioned that there are people you can't talk to at all, quite often presumably because there are issues like this. I wonder to what extent now there are ways of, shall we say, psychiatric, psychotherapeutic techniques of communicating with these sorts of individuals. I wonder to what sort of extent, if any, this is sort of taken into account in these situations.
Personally doubt it, but I mean, let's quickly.
Well, I'll just say, only because I looked at Mark Muller because I thought he planted your question, but I don't think he did. We about 3 years ago launched an initiative with MIT and Harvard on neuroscience and social conflict. And it's very much focused on what is it we can learn about what drives human behavior, particularly as it relates to conflict. Because the behavior that we see happening with ICE or the Lord's Resistance Army or any violence we see in any part of the world, unless you're thinking about it from a political science point of view that it's very strategically done, it is some of the most primal emotions that humans are capable of. There's no rationality really involved in that. So that's where you have to step back and say, what drives human behavior at an evolutionary primal point of view to carry out such acts? And so we're investigating that. And we actually think that just knowing more about what drives us as a species could actually help us reframe maybe how we address these problems.
Anybody else?
I would just say that it's very important to understand what drives us as a species, but to look at individuals is not so helpful because it is not the individuals that drive the conflict. It's usually groups of leaders, and there are often really serious strategic interests at play. So now you may have the exceptions. You may have the head of the Lord's Resistance, Kony. You may have a Saddam Hussein or his son Uday, and you may have an Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, who's the head of the Islamic State now, who may actually, I'm not even sure he's a psychopath. Maybe he is is quite rational, probably, even if some of the people that are working under him are clearly a little bit over the top, to put it mildly. But I would focus more at the maybe I'm a political scientist.
Can I just actually? Well, I was going to ask, were you trained as a political scientist?
As a sociologist, yeah. Sorry, I confess.
I should point out, our last meeting we did at MIT was on this issue, and we had a lot of political scientists there. And like economists, they're still trained in rational choice theory. And I would just say to Mark and David and the people here from Ukraine, one could argue that Vladimir Putin was operating very strategically and rationally, and from a very realpolitik perspective, in what he did in Crimea or what he's been doing in eastern Ukraine. But once you put gunpowder, sort of metaphorically, on the ground and you light that fuse, rationality is no longer what's driving a lot of the behavior of people on the ground in eastern Ukraine. It's emotion.
I must say my experience has been a bit different. For example, if you looked at many of the so-called terrorist acts that happened in Zimbabwe, they were theatrically planned to have maximum effect. Of course, they were wicked, but they were not psychopathic, because the objective of what you might call the most rational form of terrorism is to weaken the resolve of your opponent and to put terror into their hearts. If you look at what happened in Kenya, in Mau Mau, the British public thought that enormous numbers of white settlers were killed by Mau Mau. We hanged more than 11,000 black Kenyans during Mau Mau. We lost somewhere between, I think, 24 and 26 white settlers. So the imbalance was enormous. But some of those acts were extremely theatrical, so they had an enormous impact. If you look at what's happening in Iraq right now, my view is that it's not just a bunch of psychopaths rushing around. They've read the history of Islam, and they know that shock and awe were what worked for the early followers or successors of Muhammad, the early caliphs, and what they did was they put the fear of God into populations that if they didn't surrender, they would be treated with huge brutality. So by and large, they surrendered, and that's why a rather small group of tribesmen from Saudi Arabia burst out of the peninsula and conquered quite a lot of the known world. So yes, there are psychopaths, but I think it's if you like, it's doing them a disservice to deny that many of them are acting strategically and with foreknowledge of the effect of what they're going to do. Now, of course, that's a separate issue from the kind of brutality that you see, for example, in eastern Congo, with large populations just slaughtered needlessly. So I would say, that you have got mindless terror, but you've got an awful lot of strategic terror.
This will be a separate conversation next year.
Please.
No. Okay.
Go ahead. Come on.
Imaginary situation.
Let's not have a dispute over. You've got the microphone. Go ahead.
he's got
And
the
next one over here.
Okay. So imaginary situation. One man attacks another, and then there is a mediator saying that maybe there is an environment when you can talk to each other, and you will get half of your cell phone and half of your money, and there should be peaceful resolution to the conflict. So my question is to the use of the humanitarian initiatives of peace by another players, of the humanitarian initiatives as somebody else's tool in freezing the situation in a convenient situation. Do you see such a challenge? Is it the right question or not?
Who would like to?
Well,
David.
I can't imagine what conflict you might be referring to.
Ukraine, yes.
I know Ostap very well. We work very well together on Ukraine. And Andrew can also speak on this quite a bit. Humanitarian aid is manipulated often in conflict, just as much as it can be, just as much as we as humanitarian dialogue try to depoliticize it, to try to take it out of the political sphere and try to put it into the more pragmatic sphere of discussions with the two parties. Nonetheless, it is something that is often used as a political tool by the parties. I think generally taking a step back, we need to try to find, we meaning the Center for Humanitarian Dialogue, need to try to find creative ways in concert with the international aid community of the ICRCs, the International Committee for the Red Cross, and the UN aid agencies and NGO communities, so on and so forth, to try to find creative ways to engage with the parties to open up corridors for humanitarian access and for civilian protection. One of the things that I think we try to add value to as our organization is in the midst of all of these crises, when there seems to be no possibilities for political dialogue or political resolution, and norms of behavior have completely fallen through the floor. I think we try to help parties or encourage parties or demand of parties norms and laws of the Geneva Conventions of recognition for why is it an intrinsic value of itself, and why in fact it probably even serves their own purposes to try to demonstrate a goodwill towards the peoples. And I think with engagement on these norms and then on these laws, and then we hope step by step you can start to develop a habit, a framework of engagement that might in fact start to open the door to other realms of engagement. One of the tricks of the trade is, of course, trying to get parties to start to just engage even on something small, which they can agree on, and then you hope that if they find that that works, then they can find, okay, maybe I can engage with the party on this or this or this, and so on and so forth.
Thank you, gentlemen. There.
Thank you. This is another question not planted by Mark, and it's really to each of the panel members. In the event of a yes vote in the referendum, I'm wondering what specific advice each panel member would or could offer to the Scottish Government with a view to Scotland's role with regards to these international peace processes in the future. Thanks.
Thank you. I see Lord Steele is. Can we give David Steele the microphone?
Slightly different question. Andrew Gilmer at the start of his presentation mentioned Lakhdar Brahimi. Now, one of the extraordinary things about conflicts around the world in the last 20 years is that he seems to pop up all the time as the conciliator. My question is, are we short of people to do this work?
I think we're short of ability to identify people, but let's ask that each very, very quickly the question about Scotland, and then Andrew, when you answer that, can you please also tell us why is it always Lakhdar?
Can I start with that one, actually? Sorry, because it's a very good question. I mean, he is regarded as the best person for the job, actually, and time and again, he is regarded as, and I happen to believe rightly. I'm perhaps biased. I've worked closely with him and admire him hugely. He was unsuccessful on this last one, but I don't blame him at all for that. I mean, it was the fact that the Russians and the Americans, who were the two people he was relying on most to get peace for Syria, were unable to agree. The fact that the countries of the region were unable to agree, and above all the Syrian parties, and he was unable to break through the deep disagreement and the inability of the sides to disregard. I'll come back to the Scottish one after I've thought about it.
Okay, well, after you thought about it. Tim, have you thought about it?
Well, it's a wonderful country. Well, I last year had an opportunity to speak at the Scottish Parliament Festival of Politics, and it's about how a small country can project itself in the world. And the thing that struck me is to know the difference between the power of attraction and the power of projection. And I think the U.S. often gets, thrown into the category or the responsibility of projecting influence and power, whether it does it well or bad or neutrally. But a small country, and I think of Costa Rica as an example, can have the power of attraction based on its values and how it projects those values around the world. And I think people look for examples. And I think, if Scotland, even if it doesn't become independent, but just as it is today, it has a role around the world that I think could be one of attraction. And I think it should build off that. And I think seriously what Mark and the Edinburgh Festival and others are doing is bringing people here. And part of what brings people here is not just the generosity of the hosts, but the atmosphere and the ambiance and the history here. And I think that would be very important to follow.
Thank you. We're almost out of time. So Joost and then David.
I'll pass that one.
Pass,
Just
David.
a very quick point on that is I think, regardless of which way it goes, it sets a good example that through political processes, through public participation, through democratic validation, you can indeed engage in what are very difficult issues that many countries, frankly, most countries, end up going through in very violent ways. So I think it's a very good model, and I think you will, and we will certainly see people refer to this case quite often in the future.
Before we come to Mark, I just want to mention that Lakhdar Brahimi is 80 this year, and he's not in the best of health, and these kind of missions are very grueling. I mean, they're physically grueling, and they're emotionally and intellectually grueling, so the UN had better improve its capability of finding new Brahimis and a wider range of Brahimis. Mark, do you want to issue a...
Mark, can I as the only Scot on the panel, can I answer the one about Scotland, having thought about it? When I was working in Iraq, I took a group of people from the city of Kirkuk, very disputed area between the Kurdish, the Turkomans, and Arabs, to Northern Ireland. I thought there was a genuine similarity of the Northern Ireland issue to how it was resolved and to what was potentially relevant for Kirkuk. I don't see, assuming there's a yes vote, I don't see any real similarity. Of course, it'd be wonderful that if other countries broke off from each other, it didn't, as in the case of South Sudan, require 2 million deaths. And in the case of Scotland, hopefully it'll be 0 deaths. But I mean, I don't think that the Scottish example could be used. It's just not close enough to be used as an example, other than the general spirit of having a very constructive debate, as we saw earlier this afternoon. In general, and I think your question wasn't just about the Scottish example, would I be saying to my new government, should you get involved? Yes, okay, if you have a real value added, but do you have a real value added? I mean, Norway, a small country, roughly comparable population, does. It also has vast oil wealth, which it is ready to expend in very large quantities in pursuit of peace all over the world. So if Scotland is ready to use this huge oil wealth that, like Simon says, we have, then that would be great, and we would greatly, in the international peace community, welcome whatever you have. But otherwise, there are a lot of actors already. The fact that there's too many actors, and a lot of the time, you haven't seen any evidence of that on this afternoon's stage, but there's a lot of time is actually spent competing with one another, and I fear, I mean, there was a terrible case, Kieran will remember, I mean, at the beginning of the Second Intifada, where I watched countries, actually 2 Scandinavian countries, undermining each other's peace initiatives, because they would rather not have peace than that the other country should have the credit. And so I wouldn't necessarily be advising Scotland to rush into that world.
I see it more as Scots. I think Scots have a terrific role because they tend, as far as I can see, to be more internationally minded and better at languages and more ready to go forth than the more solid people south of the border, from whom I hasten to add I do not spring. Mark?
Well, Kieran, I'm told we literally have no time whatsoever. But maybe it's a question for next year. But I wanted to ask this question, and maybe someone can take 1 minute to answer it. But it's probably too large. I just wanted your views on the intelligence community, the Western intelligence community, and whether you think they identify earlier enough and then actually prevent conflict from happening.
Well, I know a little bit about the British intelligence service, and as far as I know, with the end of the Cold War, their focus is very, very largely on two things. One is counter-terrorism and the other is drugs, and not on conflict prevention. I found that when I was at the UN, I talked to them quite often because to gather information, by the way, not to give information, because you didn't get all the crap of the line to take from the Foreign Office. So they were useful in that respect, but they're not, I mean, contrary to what every Iranian thinks, they're not all-knowing, all-seeing, and all-acting.
Well, sorry for bowling that googly to you, but thank you very much.
Anybody else got a... Yes. Joost and then Tim.
I'll just add that friends of mine who serve in both this administration and a previous Democratic administration, when they got into the National Security Council in a senior position, they thought, previous administrations had these crystal balls and they had all this information and were omniscient. Then they came to realize that maybe a fourth of what they got was really useful intelligence. So I think it's just really, that's been the real lesson they have. And before I turn it over, I'm told that I have to let you know that you can get our book outside afterwards. This is good intelligence.
And by the way, anyone interested in Dick Cheney and what effect Joost's briefings had on him should read a book which is not on sale outside, which is called The Angler. And it's the most brilliant dissection of Dick Cheney and Dick Cheney's attitudes, which I'm afraid were not were not influenced for the better by a crisis group, as far as I could see. Did you want to say something about on the intelligence point?
Well, just to say, why would an intelligence agency of a country be interested in conflict prevention? It might want to aggravate the conflict. In fact, it has a national interest in taking sides in the conflict. That's why there are independent organizations, and where there's a need for independent organizations to bring independent analysis. I have found, from my experience, you can find in intelligence agencies very smart people, very good people. But that's not really relevant, because that doesn't necessarily go to the top, or that is not necessarily the view that is favored. Information is stovepiped. It's politicians who use the information in the furtherance of the national interest, and that may be in favor of conflict or in favor of conflict prevention in a given case. If it is in favor of conflict prevention, we need to use that. We need to mobilize that. We need to ally ourselves with a government like that, maybe the Norwegian government, maybe even with the American government in a certain case. But we need to be very selective about it. But the intelligence agencies are there to feed into the national strategy of their government, whatever that may be.
Thank you. I'm just going to say one thing because about the CIA station in Baghdad. It was the largest CIA station anywhere in the world ever since the Vietnam War, and it was a station that posted more dissenting complaints to Washington because of the distortion of intelligence and the censoring of intelligence that was prepared in that station. So believe it or not, it may be hard to believe, but many major intelligence organizations do have a strong sense of the integrity of the information they're providing. Andrew, you wanted to...
At the UN, Western intelligence agencies share a minute proportion of their information to the UN, and obviously not the juicy stuff, but they do if they believe that international action could forestall it. So therefore, I suspect the fact that they didn't, I don't think a single Western agency understood or believed that a Tunisian fruit vendor would lead to a fall within 1 week of the Ben Ali regime, or within that 1 month of that, Mubarak would have gone. Nobody, as far as I knew that Mosul, the second largest city in Iraq, would fall within 24 hours. And nobody envisaged that 17th of December last year, South Sudan would erupt in civil war. I don't think it's their fault. It's just not, these things are, and because also we get attacked sometimes for not having well, why, you have a whole mission in South Sudan, why didn't you realize what was happening? To which one points out that the guys with the electronic surveillance and the agents who they bribe huge amounts of money with none of them see it either. I think it's not their fault, but time and again, and the most famous case, I think, was the fall of the Shah, the CIA station in Tehran. I think it didn't have a single Farsi speaker, something absolutely incredible. But I mean, time and again, intelligence agencies don't see it coming.
The Israelis knew.
Right.
Or the end of
Shah was falling. And by the way, the lady from the Kurdish regional government office yesterday told me that that they told the British, the Americans, and the Turks months before that Mosul was going to fall, because IS planned it very, very carefully over a long period and infiltrated, and so that's why it fell almost without a struggle. Have you used up all our time, Mark?
Yes, I have.
Can I thank you all very much? But I'm afraid we're out of time.